Okay, so let me introduce. I'm going to introduce the panel first, and I'm going to start with Jamie Franks, because we're talking about the FIFA issues. We decided to find somebody who actually knew something about soccer, and so Jamie joined us. Jamie is the head coach for the men's soccer team here at the University of Denver. He's the Summit League Head Coach of the Year. Was the youngest head coach in the NCAA Division I soccer. And here's an important point. The VU team last year in 2015 was the only undefeated team in the country heading into the NCAA. Yay, Denver soccer team. But I don't think you're going to get that kind of a reception.
Why not?
Retired rugby player. Okay? Bilinach he's a mentor, he's a leadership consultant, motivational speaker, he's a best-selling author and influential blogger. He earned a doctoral degree from Harvard University, practiced as an international consultant for some 25 years. A great deal of that practice was in Europe. Which gives him some very good preparation talking about Volkswagen, as we will in a minute. He's also an adjunct professor in the Department of Management here at the Daniels College of Business. Bruce Klaw is an assistant professor in the Department of Business Ethics and Legal Studies. Previously, he was assistant professor of law in South Korea. Really much want to say North Korea, but that would be He earned his JD from Harvard Law School and has practiced law as a white-collar criminal defense attorney. That's the word it for. He didn't practice as a white-collar criminal.
Still practice.
And our discussion leader, whom some of you have met in previous events with us, Paul Gibbons, is an international consultant. He's the founder of a company called Future Considerations, a London-based consultancy serving the global financial services market. He's author of a relatively new book published in 2014, The Science of Successful Organizational Change. He's a well-known public speaker, executive coach, and also an adjunct professor here at the Daniels College of Business. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to start off our discussion off.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. And I'd like to start by welcoming everybody, particularly two groups of people, the people who are new, because for something like this to prosper and for the ethics conversations that begin to percolate the Denver business ecosystem, thanks to the new blood, also the younger people who are coming here, and I think it's important that business ethics conversations begin to infect, if you will, that's the wrong choice of words, but the younger generation, the millennial generation. And not just the people who are the stewards of local industry. So welcome particularly to the people from Net Impact and some of our younger members today. Dan and I had a very robust discussion about which topics to choose. I had some different ones and he had some different ones. And what was interesting about that discussion is that these three topics do not by any means exhaust the list of ethical topics we could have brought up for 2015. We had Martin Shkreli, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He's a headcount mismanager and also implicated in the increasing the price of a life-saving drug by 750%. That's a very interesting issue. We also had Uber, which is having a powerful effect for good and sometimes for ill, and a number of communities that could have brought that up. And today, just like yesterday, Apple is in the news with something which is of vital interest to all of us about sometimes the question of liberty versus security. And there's a very famous phrase, if you give up a little liberty to get some security, you deserve neither. And it's a question we'll be wrestling with, I think, for the next several years, is the Apple question. So this doesn't exhaust the list, but these are the ones we thought would be most fertile for today. And so we prepared with my colleague a cheat sheet. These are enormously complex issues. There will be many, many books, full-length books written about each one of them. These are some of the facts of the case. In Volkswagen, 500,000 cars were recalled. That soon became 11 million cars. The defeat device recognizes when the engine is being tested by the regulators. It reduces the nitrous oxide emissions, which are most toxic. And then when the test is passed, they go back to normal settings, which improve the gas mileage and the CO2 emissions. So there's a trade-off there. And the engineers found a way to defeat that. Volkswagen are enormous. They're the number one in the world. They have 3.5% of the United States car market. Their strategy is to stay and remain number one in the world. Penetration of the US market is essential to that. And there are some interesting regulatory points. In many industries, the US is less highly regulated than in this particular instance. The US is actually more tightly regulated, it seems, than the European car industry. And the regulators in Europe take a self-regulation approach, in a way. So there will be some interesting facts about that. The board will be interested to many of my colleagues here as well. The complexion of the board is very interesting at Volkswagen. It's about half representatives from the union. There are 2 representatives from the local government, the state of Saxony, and there are only one management representative, and then 2 representative seats from families, very old German families. One name you'll know, Porsche, and the other one is Pierre. And they both get seats, and in one article on this, one of those seats is held by someone who, prior to joining the board of Volkswagen, was a kindergarten teacher. That's obviously a controversial thing. So there are questions there about board representation, the thing we want to pay attention to when we get into the content. Of course, there are no independent directors, what we think of as an independent expert director on the board. In FIFA, this has been around. This is the worst kept secret in sports, apparently. Much like doping in biking and some of the doping in the Olympics. It finally began to surface about the middle of the last decade with a number of documentaries in England. It seems to be that those were completely ignored for about a decade. It broke into the news in 2014, 2015. Sepp Blatter, S-E-P-P, Blatter, was the president of FIFA and has been for a very long time. He's investigated for 150 million in bribes. But the whole organization, I think there have been 19 arrests. Is that correct, Jamie? More than 19 arrests. Several people in the United States in sports marketing organizations and several FIFA executives from around the world. There's implications in bribery for the games in Russia, which are about to happen in 2 years. For the games in Qatar, which are about to happen in 6 years. For the games which happened in South Africa. The very president of South Africa is implicated in a $10 million, potentially alleged $10 million bribe to the organization to secure the games for South Africa. And so the antecedents or the causes of this are very interesting. It is hard to, living in the United States, particularly in this part of the United States, appreciate the size of the World Cup. It's an extraordinary thing. It's as if the Super Bowl happens in 209 countries in the world at the same time, but for 6 weeks. It's an extraordinary amount of money at stake. And the estimates that Brazil will spend something like $15 billion. They'll spend $15 billion on new stadia. So it's an extraordinary amount of money to go around in the World Cup, and it's huge business. So the non-economic benefits, because a lot of that money may not be recouped, are enormous too. The feel-good factor, putting your country on the national stage, there's an enormous amount at stake. So it's fair to say, in the instance of FIFA, all of the executives have been dragged kicking and screaming into court. There have been no people willing, apart from one gentleman, willing to come forward and say mea culpa and let me assist you in your investigations. That's unlike the case with Volkswagen, where almost the day after the chief executive stepped down. There was one very interesting quote from one of the head of Volkswagen North America. Gave testimony really very quickly, very soon into the investigation, about 4 weeks in. And he gave testimony, and one of the things he said was very interesting. He said, "It looks to me as if only a couple of engineers were involved." He said, and I realize it's incredibly hard to believe. So we'll still find. I'm just wondering whether you could put a defeat device on 11 million cars with only a couple of guys in a back room running the shows. So very interesting. But again, Volkswagen handled this very differently, and one of the things we'll want to pick up as people who are business executives is not whether and how the ethical failure happened. That's interesting. It's super interesting. You want to talk about that. But you want to talk about the response, because there are famous examples of very strong responses with Johnson & Johnson's Tylenol and then very poor responses. So how do people respond is an ethical dilemma in itself. And then finally on the LIBOR, I was a trader. I used to do this back in the 1980s for my sins. So LIBOR may, again, not mean that much in the middle of the United States. $450 trillion of financial assets are priced off LIBOR. That's a lot of money, last I checked. And it touches every aspect, every loan to every corporation, every loan to every sovereign, every piece of sovereign debt in the world. It's fundamental to the functioning of the international banking system. So there were two types of manipulations that happened. One was external, and one seems to imply collusions among the banks, and there's even a question about whether the British government were involved in some of this collusion. So one of the things they did is LIBOR is used to price credit transactions. And so a bank like Barclays will have a lot of credit transactions on its books that are very sensitive in value to the price of LIBOR. The people who were, in a sense, managing that part of Barclays' credit portfolio would go to the traders who fix the LIBOR, which is a global standard interest rate benchmark, and say, I have such and such positions. Can you move LIBOR up or down in order to benefit my positions? And so they did. They put in different bids. London Interbank offered rate. They put in different bids for the price of LIBOR based on the proprietary positions of Barclays Bank. So that's the internal dimension of it. The external dimension of it is that when Barclays was in considerable trouble in 2007 and 2008, there was another incentive, because if your LIBOR, your borrowing rate, seemed to the world to be higher, it's an implication that there was distress. There's a big difference between borrowing at 3% or 4% or 5%. And so there was an incentive then for Barclays to keep their LIBOR rates low, so it looked like they weren't in distress. Now, were that just Barclays, that wouldn't affect any of us very, very much. But these rates are, again, set by Barclays, are a global interest rate standards. There are winners and losers. There's also an implication in the press, you might have seen, that this was done in such a British way, but I think it was the Minister of the Treasury, or it might have been George Osborne, got in touch with the then CEO of Barclays, who's called Bob Diamond, and in the most British, understated way, wanted to know why Barclays' LIBOR rates seemed to be a little bit higher than everyone else, thus bringing up the average for the banking system. And in a very British way, suggested we don't really want to have these things up as high as perhaps they are, and could we perhaps moderate these in a very, very indirect British diplomatic way. So there's an implication as well during the time of the crisis that in order to keep banks looking stable, we wanted to keep LIBOR as low as possible. So this is an enormous manipulation. UBS was fined $1.5 billion. 2 traders were arrested. But what's really interesting is that they've been unable to catch anybody else in the net. Now, this is an extraordinary thing. There are 150 different LIBOR rates set every day. 10 currencies, 15 different rate fixings. That's an amazing thing. How did only 2 guys have been prosecuted, these 2 UBS guys, 6 brokers were prosecuted and exonerated, I should hasten to add, one of whom, by the way, goes by the moniker Lord LIBOR. So it's a fascinating thing, right? This guy's off. And so here we have something which is truly, truly systemic. It affects everybody in the world. So I'm going to introduce, just before turning over to some of our experts here, a couple of the headline ethical issues. Those of you who've been here before remember we had a session on ethical fading. Ethical fading is when you take an issue that most of us in this room would see as an ethical issue and turn it into some other kind of issue, an engineering issue or a commercial issue. And so for the engineers at Volkswagen, how to get the emissions down was an engineering problem. It wasn't an ethical problem. That's called ethical fading. The other thing is the revolving door that we talk about in the United States quite a lot between industry, regulators, and lobbyists. And obviously you want experts regulating your industry, but when it becomes too cozy, then you have problems with potentially collusion or potentially the old boys club. And the gentleman who runs the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom was the auditor originally, earlier in his career at KPMG, of one of the banks who was being investigated by the Financial Conduct Authority. So you have an example of
Yes, sir. In the spirit of a panel discussion, I think I'll just sit here with you guys, if that's all right. Volkswagen just continues to develop. Just Tuesday, I saw an article in the paper that Mexico has fined Volkswagen $8.9 million, and they're probably not through because they had only examined Volkswagens from a couple of years, and now they're looking at other years of Volkswagen. So it's a huge issue for Volkswagen. It continues to be a huge issue. And I think one of the most fascinating understatements that I've ever heard, the Volkswagen CEO said that this whole crisis has had somewhat of a negative impact on our brand. And so it's kind of fascinating. I'm not going to speak a whole lot about the composition of the board because it is an interesting composition in that you have the Works Council, the government, and then in this case the Porsche family, who are the main shareholders there. And so I think that it's not truly an independent board like we would think of boards here in this country. But I know that Jamie's going to talk a lot about how FIFA was essentially kind of self-regulating. The people who were accused in some cases of FIFA were sort of the people who were making the ethical decisions. So I'm going to leave that for you because I know you're going to talk about that in more detail. One of the things that strikes me about the whole Volkswagen thing is intentionality. If you think about another big car company issue we've had recently, here in the U.S., was General Motors with the ignition switch problem. People familiar with that? And General Motors didn't set out to make faulty ignition switches. Now, I realize that their response when they first found out that there was a problem with the ignition switches probably wasn't what it should be. But the people at Volkswagen actually call this a defeat device. So think about it. I mean, they will openly refer to the software that was installed that lets the cars test one way when in actuality on the highway they emit differently. And then sometimes four or five times higher than how they test. And so, I mean, the fact that they actually call it a defeat device, to me, talks about intentionality. And, you know, you spoke about the idea of a couple engineers someplace. And, you know, all of you, work in business. If you work in any kind of manufacturing organization, most companies will have something like a cost improvement program. And people are challenged to come up with CIPs every year. And so it's kind of hard for me to imagine, us four engineers sitting around saying, hey, for our CIP this year, why don't we come up with some way to actually game the regulatory system on emissions? And that's going to be a great CIP, and we're going to really do well for the company. It's hard for me to imagine that. And so, call me a skeptic, but when I hear the senior people at Volkswagen basically kind of push this down to a few bad apples, a few overzealous engineers, I kind of think to myself, well, I'm just not buying that one. So I think that there's a huge ethical issue for me is that the Volkswagen senior people really aren't owning up to it. Now the CEO did, when this came to light, did resign very shortly. However, the new CEO is going around the world, and he came even to the U.S., and one of the points that he has been making is that defeat devices aren't illegal in Europe. Not that they're legal, they're not illegal. So, my attorney friend here can probably speak a little bit more to that. But I mean, so the idea is they're not illegal in Europe, and besides that, other companies have been doing some things like this. And so don't be so hard on us. And that was kind of the message here in the U.S. And you're right, the standards here in the U.S. Are a little higher, and automobiles are a little more highly regulated when it comes to emission standards than they are around the world. But the whole idea of being not illegal in Europe, and I thought one of the classic quotes that I saw, I got this out of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, was he was testifying before the Scottish Parliament. And if you've ever watched any British parliamentary stuff, it can be quite amusing. Just when they were debating whether or not Donald Trump should be allowed into Great Britain after his remarks about Muslims in this country. But anyway, one of the members of the Scottish Parliament said to the CEO of Volkswagen, let me get this right here, "You seem to dance on the head of legal jargon," which I thought was really kind of fascinating. And so, to me, a big issue here as we go forward. I mean, yes, clearly Volkswagen did something wrong. I personally don't think they're handling it very well. But I think a huge issue, and I really would be interested in hearing what other people have to say, and I know that we have several attorneys in the audience, is something that is legal or not illegal, is that necessarily ethical? And, and I think that's kind of, Volkswagen seems to be staking itself, it's not illegal, at least in Europe, and so there's kind of ethical. So I think that's an interesting question, that we can address here, this whole issue of legality what is ethical. And then it also kind of gets into this whole issue of where does corporate responsibility lie? I think on one end of the continuum, basically executives of corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. On the other end, someone like Elizabeth Warren might say executives have responsibility not only to their shareholders, but they have responsibility to the communities where they do business, as you pointed out, where they make the cars, and the societies in which they operate in terms of things like, in this case, emissions. And, so I think that's another interesting question. The two questions that come for me are, what ethical versus legal, are they the same, are they different? And then the second one of where does responsibility lie? We're not talking about it, but it's another thing we could talk about, is the whole issue of corporate inversions. One of my old clients, Pfizer, decides to buy Allergan, domicile themselves in Ireland, to basically, and they say, to avoid paying taxes. And when they talked to Ian Reed, CEO, Ian basically said, our responsibility is to the shareholders of Pfizer, therefore, this is in the best interest of the shareholders. They aren't really moving. Their headquarters are still going to be at 235 East 42nd Street in New York. And the only thing that's going to be different is they kind of changed their address. And so, to me, the two issues that I see that come from many ethical issues, particularly Volkswagen, are A, legality versus ethical, and then also, where does the responsibility of senior officers and directors of corporations lie? Solely to the shareholders, or is there some other area that deals with just what I'll call community? And so I think that those are the two kind of things that I'd like to throw out, and hopefully we can talk about after we get done speaking up here.
Very good, thank you. Thanks very much, Bud. Bruce, are you ready to go over some LIBOR?
Sure. So the LIBOR scandal, I think, is just the most recent example of several similar scandals that we've seen over the course of the last couple of years, and I think there are a number of takeaway lessons that we can all learn from it. I'd say first and foremost, I think business and business managers would be wise to remain particularly vigilant when their products or services affect lots of downstream users and multiple jurisdictions, right? LIBOR is pegged effectively to $450 trillion worth of financial products. So a small tweak in LIBOR can have tremendous downstream trickles. And this is something we saw also with the rating agencies during the financial crisis, right? Where a number of end users are really relying on the veracity of the reports as to the creditworthiness of the financial products that were being peddled. And so, there are a number of reasons to do this, right? The fines or damages that are ultimately result from any misconduct in those areas can be tremendously large. You might have to face consequences of multiple regulators in different jurisdictions, which we saw with LIBOR, with Canadian regulators, Japanese regulators, Swiss regulators, American regulators, British regulators, EU regulators all want to get a piece of that pie. And of course, the sort of consequences don't end with just governmental, regulators imposing fines or civil penalties, but also downstream plaintiffs, right? And in a case like LIBOR, you've got potential plaintiffs everywhere, from credit card holders to mortgagors, to municipalities that use swaps to sort of manage their fixed income cash flows. I think one of the major lessons here is something that Ben Franklin said, hundreds of years ago, right? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And so I really think it's incumbent upon business for us to learn from this and recognize it's critically important to educate your workforce, right? Educate your workforce not just on the potential, legal implications or fines, but also I think the way to approach it that tends to be effective is to focus not just on the particularities of the law, but focus on the ethical core that we're talking about here. And I think that really distills down in most white-collar criminal cases to four things: lying, cheating, stealing, and harming people or property that just ain't yours, right? And I think it really does boil down to those simple lessons. And those are the lessons that prosecutors are going to be looking for, right? Because they have to explain that, should that case go to trial, they have to explain it to a jury. A jury is not going to understand the nuances of LIBOR necessarily, but they do understand cheating when they see it, right? And so at the end of the day, I think those are the core lessons that we can use to sort of educate our workforce there. Focus on those core ethical behaviors: lying, cheating, stealing, and harming people and property that just isn't yours. I do think, picking up from what Bud was saying, I think we can educate our workforce that they do in fact have responsibilities to the public, particularly the end downstream users of these products and services, right? Much like a lot of people were relying on the veracity of credit rating agency reports, they were relying on LIBOR to be accurate. I'd say we can educate our workforce better on the appropriate use of email and chat software, right? At the end of the day, it's very hard to explain your way out of emails that say, sure, I'll do you a favor and bump up LIBOR. Right? At the end of the day, really, really hard. Sometimes it's apparently successful, like we've seen in a couple of the recent acquittals in the UK. It wasn't particularly effective in the prosecutions that have been brought in the United States, right? And so often an ill-worded email or chat, right, is the difference between an acquittal and a conviction. I think business, would do well, I think, to remember that they really do need to implement additional controls and safeguards to prevent conflicts of interest that are, foreseeable, right? At the end of the day, part of the reason that Hayes was asking people to tweak LIBOR was because his bonuses were tied purely to how big his deal size was. The LIBOR is going to affect that. And so, that's ripe for conflict of interest. Conflict of interest being, you're serving two masters at once, those two interests of those masters conflict. I think it's incumbent to recognize that, we do have to take, extra precautions to implement effective walls between the revenue and the reporting units, right? This was something that got S&P into trouble in the rating agency scandal, right? They purported to give unbiased, creditworthiness ratings, but at the same time were reliant on their customers to give them revenue lest they go over to another rating agency. And we saw that here too. And, I think one of the interesting takeaways from the LIBOR scandal is that UBS's compliance department caught some of this in 2009. And they said, hey, wait a minute, we really shouldn't have the traders directly submitting, the LIBOR figures. And they transferred that over to their asset and liability management department. But they didn't effectively impose that wall, so the traders would still be in regular contact with the folks who were reporting LIBOR. So I think the notion is, set up that wall and then take it seriously. I think, another takeaway here, as Paul mentioned, you may need to act even if the regulators don't immediately require it. So, Barclays first reported that its numbers were probably fishy. It reported that to Tim Geithner back in April of 2008. And Geithner, for various reasons, appears to have not taken action at that time, right? Because he's concerned about the financial crisis, he's concerned about bank liquidity, so he's not acting. That doesn't mean that you can think that you're necessarily in the clear. That would be a sort of false read of that situation, I think. And I do think that sometimes doing the ethical thing often requires doing more than the law requires and less than it allows, right? And I do think that's a message that should resonate. I think we do well to remember and anticipate that there are going to be multiple spokes coming out of a financial crisis, right? I think as soon as you see a crisis as big as the financial crisis that we saw in 07, 08, 09, you've got to anticipate that regulators are really going to be looking in multiple different areas, right? It may have started with looking at, countrywide and mortgages, but gradually went over to the securitizers, right? The investment banks, and went over to the rating agencies, and went over to the banks setting LIBOR, and went on to Forex. And so I think you have to anticipate, that the storm may blow your way. I think a lesson to take away here is that enforcement is going to continue to be on both individuals and their corporate entities. As many of you know, the Deputy Attorney General of the U.S., Sally Yates, announced what may have been a new policy in September of 2015, sort of redoubling her intent to go after individuals and keep individuals in mind as she negotiates settlements with corporations. Certainly, although we've seen some failures in a British jury to convict a couple of traders at smaller banks. The DOJ has taken it much more seriously here, at least, charging 13, 4 have pled guilty, 2 Rabobank traders were convicted at trial just a few months ago. So I think those are going to continue to operate in parallel. I think another major lesson from the LIBOR scandal is beware the rise of the CFTC. There's a new regulator in town. Effectively, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission was kind of the stepchild of the regulatory world and kind of a regulator in name only for a number of years. Dodd-Frank changed that. Dodd-Frank changed that and gave it broad powers over futures and derivatives. Gave it the ability, a unique ability, to impose civil regulatory penalties for false statements, even without proving knowledge of that the statements were false at the time they were made. It imposes a sort of should-have-known standard, which is, could give rise to tremendous additional liability. And the CFTC has really used these powers, right? It wants its piece of the pie. It wants its pound of flesh. I mean, it got $200 million from Barclays, $475 million from Rabo, $700 million from UBS, $800 million from Deutsche Bank. And so the CFTC is going to go for its pound of flesh. And I do think we'd all, do well to keep in mind there's a new regulator in town. We don't have to just worry about the DOJ or the SEC. It's now also the CFTC. And clearly, there's been an effort to staff up these regulatory agencies like the Enforcement Division of the CFTC and the SEC with former federal prosecutors, right? We saw that switch when Mary Jo White, became commissioner of the SEC, and Andrew Seresny, both of whom I worked with for many, many years, are both former federal prosecutors who take this stuff very seriously and have a unique ability, take my word for it, to cut through a complex case down to its core and down to its ethical core. They're just really good at what they do. And we've seen that now with the CFTC as well, where they've put former federal prosecutors in charge of enforcement. I think we got to watch out for compliance with deferred and non-prosecution agreements now. It's no longer the case that you can just sign a non-pros or a deferred pros, pay a little money, and then forget about it. What we saw with UBS, they had a non-prosecution agreement requiring them to not commit any additional crimes for 2 years. They violated that with the Forex scandal, which followed soon thereafter, and the DOJ ripped up their non-prosecution agreement. And it demanded guilty pleas. As public pressure increases on these scandals, it's not going to be sufficient for these prosecutors to just simply go for a penalty with a little fine. They're actually going to require, and they did in UBS's case, they required a guilty plea, and not just by a subsidiary, by the corporate parent itself. And so I do think we're seeing increased seriousness here. And so should a business become subject to a deferred or non-prosecution agreement, I think it's incumbent to remain vigilant that you're adhering to that. Not just requiring an external compliance monitor. And finally, I suppose one of the last lessons here is be the first to report. In a case like an antitrust case, right? You can actually qualify for leniency or immunity if you're the first one to come through the door and report to regulators. So we saw that that effectively amounted in part to paying 1/3 less than subsequent banks ended up having to pay. So Barclays paid $450 million in its settlement. UBS, had to pay $1.5 billion, and so that can matter a lot. And so I'd throw it to you guys to sort of assess when you might want to proactively report. And certainly in a case where there are multiple bad actors, I think the better approach is not to say, well, everybody's doing it so nobody reports. I think that's a very risky strategy. I think you want to be the first one in the door, and hopefully be able to mitigate your losses there. So some ideas and takeaways for you guys. I'd welcome your thoughts on that.
Very, very, very strong points. Jamie, have you got some insights for some feedback?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between the Volkswagen and the LIBOR case with FIFA is that these are very, very complex cases with multiple layers. I think when FIFA it continues to come out, it's a very, very simple case, actually. And I think to fully understand the case, it's important to remember that FIFA has increased world football, its global popularity, and its financial success beyond imagination. So in the eyes of many people around the world, it's viewed in a positive light. FIFA runs the World Cup that generates billions of dollars in cash through revenue, through corporate sponsors, through broadcasting rights, and through merchandise. The countries and the peoples that have benefited from this view FIFA not only in a positive light, but still support them. Even after all of this came down on Sepp Blatter, there was an election only 2 weeks after when the scandals came out. Believe it or not, he was reelected. So you can imagine how some of the rest of the world views FIFA still. The main question surrounding FIFA is really how could a nonprofit doing humanitarian work to bring sport to the world continue corruption for so long? How could a company so large, on such a large scale, get so corrupt? How was there no accountability from any members of the organization? Corruption charges are dating back to 1991. They cast doubt over the transparency and honesty for the process of allocating the World Cup tournaments, electing its presidents and its executives, and the administration of the funds within the organization. So for me, unlike these other two cases, this is a very, very simple case. There's 4 simple points to learn from the FIFA. 1, there was no regulations and there was limited governance. So FIFA is a nonprofit organization. There's no owners. There's no independent governance. There was no agency who was watching over their business or their transactions. These mutually benefited relationships between the large sports marketing groups, the broadcast corporations, and FIFA are really at the centerpiece, their relationships with each other. Number 2, the structure of the voting process is flawed. The voting system created the environment for these individuals to take bribes. The elected presidents and the executives, they had no incentives to change the voting system because they were the ones that were benefiting from it. The 209 members all get a single vote. So Brazil, Germany have the same as the African countries. The African countries make up 54 of the 209 members. So FIFA operates in a social and economic culture around the world that bases a lot of their business transactions on relationships. So over time, these relationships only got stronger, where eventually a lot of these deals that were made were deemed as doing favors for friends. 3, the terminology "the good old boys" continues to go in anytime you hear the FIFA case, it's at the headlines of it. FIFA senior executives have held their positions for long terms of service, and because of this, they became a very tight-knit group who felt actually entitled to these riches. The indicted executives were in mutual secrecy in which they conducted all their businesses. So when asked or interviewed about speculations, even until this day, there still remains a failure to acknowledge corruption or even any problems at the institutional level. They don't think that the voting process is flawed. When these individuals, anybody who is indicted, they still are actually giving interviews, which is the amazing part of it all. There's a great sense of anger when asked some of these questions. So for me, and then the 4th one is the unaccounted cash flows. Anytime that there's charges filed with racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering, there tends to be some sort of unaccounted cash flow surrounding these business type transactions. Even till this day, they cannot put hard numbers, and that's why when you read different articles, when you go to different media outlets, there's conflicting reports on what the final numbers are for the World Cups, the cash inflows and outflows. What were the profits and the expenses? There's still conflicting reports there. So for me, like I said, it's a little bit different than the other cases because in summary, the combination of FIFA's voting system for their executives combined with the limited governance in which they did business, ultimately created this culture all the way dating back to 91 of these old boys who became a tight-knit group that conducted their business to benefit themselves. So there's been other cases like this in the past, but I don't know if at such a global scale has it ever been this way. So the main question still remains in these type of cultures is who was supposed to regulate them? Was there ethical practice going on? Was there anybody up top that really could have blown the whistle, come forward with it? So for me, FIFA, the main takeaway from FIFA is how could something for so long go on this way at such a global scale when there's been other cases dating past for the past 3 decades that have these same type of complications that were at the centerpiece of why it happened.
You know, one of the things that strikes me, listening to you speak about it, I do think you talk about the old boy network, I mean, it sounds to me like that was in play in LIBOR too.
Absolutely.
So there was a similarity there as I listened to both of you guys speak.
And no doubt the culture of engineering in Volkswagen. I mean, no doubt. You know, the people, the work teams of engineers.
Well, we're really talking too about that centralized power control, the executives. Which ones are making the decisions, and how are those decisions? How are those individuals being elected to make these decisions?
Very good. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to open it up, not necessarily just to questions. I really appreciate very much that there are experts in the audience. And so this is an opening also for commentary from everyone here, as well as questions. So have we a microphone that's moving around? Ashley's helping us out. Who would like to go first, please? Would you tell us who you are?
Sure.
Do you mind,
Jennifer
Carly?
Bilinach, I'm the ethics officer for Lockheed Martin. My question is actually for Jamie. I was curious whether you've had conversations with your athletes about this FIFA situation, whether they see it as having relevant lessons for their professional lives or their sport careers. And if you could just share maybe either your perspective in talking with them about it or their perspectives that they've offered.
Ironically enough, most of the guys that are on the student athletes that are on my team actually are business of the Daniel School business, and Bud actually has a couple of them. So they are very intrigued by this case. I think the thing is, as the case has kind of started to unfold, I think that when they continue to receive more information or listen to Jack Warner or some of these executives, it becomes very clear that there was unethical practice at the top, and that these guys very, very much at the top were making these decisions that were driving the rest of the culture. For us in my program, we talk a lot about accountability and what that actually means. And first, you have to hold yourself accountable before you hold other people accountable. So for us, we try to tie, or really when it came out in June, we have tried to tie the larger part of the accountability and who was actually accountable to how we just have everyday practices within our organization. Do they go to class? Do they get there on time? Do they do their homework ethically? So things like that, we've just tried to come back down to them and really kind of hone in on the self-accountability. As our culture continues to grow, this will be my second season. This winter and this spring, we're really looking for individuals to not only hold themselves accountable, but each other accountable, and that's really kind of where we're moving towards.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question, please. Or a comment. Gentleman in front, Gary, please. I think Ashley's. Oh, Oh, would you like to go first for,
Sure,
just
I'll
for
go
a
first.
point of view of geography? You remind us, Carrie? Please.
My name is Shannon Brennan, and I'm from Intelligence, and I was just curious for your guys' views on what you think cultures in the different countries that are involved in some of these scandals really play in contributing to them, and the viewpoints in different countries about what is ethical and how that contributed.
That sounds like what you're a culture consultant. Makes sense.
I spent some time in Germany, and I've worked with mostly U.S.-based companies, but in Germany. And it's pretty hierarchical in Germany. So, again, the idea how, with the Volkswagen piece, how engineers got sort of blamed on this, I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if, and it may not have been called a defeat device at that point, but had they not been given some direction. And because of sort of the nature of what I know a little bit of German society and certainly business in Germany, people tend to salute and say, yes, sir. So that may have been a contributing factor here. I don't know that for a fact. I'm purely speculating on it. I find it's interesting here in this country how we battle over regulations. If you just look at the political debates on both parties, you'll see that one side sort of thinks that less regulation is better, and the other side seems to think that more regulation is better. I personally would like to hope for the better nature of human beings, but sometimes I'm proven wrong on that. I must admit, I got to give you kudos. I love what you said about do more than what's required and less than
The law allows.
less than the law allows. I thought that was an interesting take on it. We are finding, though, in this country, this society, we seem to be taking regulation a little more seriously than in other places around the world. I have no idea why that's the case, but I'm interested to hear because you deal with internationally, and you certainly, soccer is very much an international sport. What do you guys think about this?
I guess my sense is, it depends on kind of what issue we're talking about specifically. I think one sort of big issue is the issue of commercial bribery. Is it wrongful to pay, a supplier or, your business counterparty? Look, it's not surprising that people have some different views on this. I mean, even our regulatory system in the United States doesn't have the same view on this. Commercial bribery is illegal in Colorado, but not in a number of other states. And so, I'd love to sort of reach consensus. I'd love for the business community to come together and reach consensus and realize that, there are limits to sort of gift giving, and there are limits to sort of establishing relationships appropriately. And so, with respect to the LIBOR scandal in particular, I don't know that there are sort of cultural shifts between countries. I do think maybe there's a cultural difference in perhaps certain segments of industry. So, the finance sector tends to, have certain notorious sort of repetitive problems about what is perceived to be wrongful, and some of that is just being myopic in what you consider to be the who you owe duties to and what the downstream consequences are. I mean, what you saw with all the emails that went back and forth between the LIBOR boys was they were perceiving this as doing a solid for their regular trading counterparties without any consideration of the sort of downstream people to whom they might owe duties. So I would certainly love to reach some consensus about public fiduciary duties, frankly, in private business.
One of the interesting points you brought up was the question of bribery, which doesn't always look like bribery. I know in England they cracked down on it very hard in the last 2 decades. I've had government clients in England. I can't buy them a cup of coffee. They are not allowed to accept a cup of coffee from me. I mean, we kind of joke about it. If I said, let me get you lunch, we can't. To what extent is that the case in industries or the culture in different industries? Are you familiar with that kind of super strict regulation of patronage or bribery or whatever you'd like to call it? Does anyone have some insight on that? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jackie Becker, and I do work all over the globe, And I see significant differences culturally from one place to another. The issues all appear very similarly, but how they see those issues and whether they integrate or do not integrate into our way of looking at what is right or what is those things really does matter. The cultural hierarchy of saving face, of relationships, all play a role. In Indonesia, to answer your question specifically, they have two separate taxing authorities. One that deals with foreign investments over a certain amount, those companies, and one that deals with the regular tax districts. In the foreign tax, it's not a foreign tax, it's a local tax, but in the office that deals with the foreign investors, they pay their staff significantly higher than they do in the other office, and they have strict rules about what you can take. You cannot take a cup of coffee, things you would see here much more in England, much more so than you ever do there. Those people covet that job so much because of the increase in pay that you see very little bribery going on within that structure, which in Indonesia is a miracle, frankly. In the other, it is threatened with 1,000 problems. And so, yes, I have seen differences all over, to be very honest with you.
Anyone else have a comment on some of that? Yes, please.
You know, just from, so I work as a change management consultant. I work as a change management consultant, and most recently with Wells Fargo. In the past, I've worked with the national division. And I would say that, you know, in an increasingly globalized and interconnected society, shared values have never been more important than they are today. Working on the most recent initiative with a client, you know, we're talking about 100 different countries. And each of those countries has their different way of doing business. They have a different way of approaching negotiations. They have a different way of approaching project management. So, you know, what I would say is it comes down to ethical pillars, okay? And you know, they serve as the guiding constitution or framework for an organization. So, as an organization, especially as an international organization, what are your guiding pillars, or your ethical pillars, rather? How do they align with the organizational culture that you seek to maintain or establish as an organization? And then third, how does your workforce align or support those pillars? And I think that's a question that a lot of organizations using, you know, FIFA, for example, a lot of other organizations as well have to ask themselves. Because we live in an age where transparency, I mean, we're only getting more and more transparent. We're only getting more and more interconnected. So as we operate across you know, borders and across seas with the click of a button, and we're so interconnected. You know, do these people share the values that our organization seeks to maintain and achieve?
Well, thank you.
Yeah, can I make a comment on that? You know, Paul, you had mentioned J&J with Tylenol. Now, they have since lost their way since that time. But at that point, what was so interesting was you talk about shared values. Johnson & Johnson is very famous for its credo. The very first line in the Johnson & Johnson credo is, our first responsibility is to the patients, the physicians, and the mothers and other people who use our product. And when this whole Tylenol thing happened, which seems like yesterday to me, it was 1980, somebody had tampered with a bottle of Tylenol in one store. And to emphasize their shared values, the Johnson & Johnson pulled Tylenol from all the shelves throughout the United States. And I think that
hundreds of millions of dollars.
I'm sorry?
Hundreds of millions
Hundreds
of
of
dollars.
millions.
Yeah.
And that gets to the point that you're making about shared values. And I do think that as you talk about shared values, it's incumbent on executives to be the ones who, I wouldn't even say enforce, who'd be the ones who champion these shared values so that people do, regardless of the culture where they are, act in a manner that's consistent with it. And like I said, it's unfortunate recent, at least since the turn of this century, events have unfolded that they have sort of Johnson & Johnson has acted a little against which, some of the values in their credo. But I really do believe that's a strong way to make sure that a company operates in an ethical manner.
Very good. We had a question from up front. Should we take that, Gary? You have a microphone for Gary? Unless you...
Gary Moran. I'm an adjunct professor at Gibbons. I was going to ask Jamie why he felt the U.S. Justice Department was the one to blow the whistle on FIFA. I mean, arguably, soccer is not as much a part of our society as it is on a lot of others around the world. Why were we the ones to pull the plug on it?
Well, it happened in Zurich when FIFA was meeting and Interpol kind of intercepted. And then once started, Jack Glazer was the one U.S. Guy who was an executive on FIFA. He came out. He was one of the first guys that Bruce talked about, talking about lessening his penalty if he gave information out. And I think when information started to continue to come out about this money laundering, wiring, it was happening down in banks in Miami. So I felt that Loretta Lynch felt like she was the one that, because it was happening and because it was bypassing through U.S. banks, that it was it was our turn.
You had an interesting comment on jurisdiction.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things there. I think one of the other reasons is that when FIFA launched its own internal investigation, it chose Michael Garcia, former EDNY U.S. attorney. And frankly, if you're going to choose a U.S. attorney to conduct your own internal investigation, you got to be prepared that he's going to try to do his job and do his job well. And so he got very loud when when FIFA tried to squash the findings from his initial report, and I think that caused some of it. I think another note, I guess, is the U.S. approaches its jurisdictional scope very broadly, more broadly than most civil law countries do. Any dollar-denominated transaction, even in some cases an email that passes through, can confer jurisdiction.
An email that passes through a U.S. server.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah. No. Again, any dollar-denominated transaction necessarily goes through the U.S. Emails that make their way to the U.S. Right. That's going to confer jurisdiction. And then finally, I just point out a little nuance here. Right. We all kind of perceive of the FIFA scandal as a bribery scandal. They're not being charged with bribery, right? Because U.S. bribery law does not go that far, right? The FCPA is only about government officials, and FIFA is not that. But I think the lesson to be learned from that is that the U.S. will find creative ways when there is public incentive to do so. And so you'll see a wire fraud charge, you'll see a money laundering charge, which have extraterritorial scope.
As with Al Capone. It's the money that got him and not the bullets and the blood.
Right.
And that's very much the case here. It's RICO, racketeering, it's money laundering, it's tax evasion. So those are where they're getting these guys, and not particularly on buying votes, on collusion around the voting process, around bribery or anything like that. Because bribery is a very slippery thing, apparently, to define. Is that right?
Oh, I don't know about that, but it's a little, I think it was just simply a function of, U.S. law punishes, federal U.S. law punishes foreign bribery when it's a bribery of a foreign public official, and here we just simply didn't have that, so the U.S. was incentivized to find other ways, and it has.
Right. Very, very good. Thank you. Great question. Mary Beth, is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm a board director of a great company. And I have a question for Jamie. I'm curious, I heard from you that the other government entities across the world are still very supportive of FIFA, yeah, I'm pronouncing it right. But my question is about the teams from each country. Why they are not maybe incensed when a decision like Qatar is made, which is, extreme conditions to be able to play in them, that they don't gather together the teams of the U.S., the teams of Germany, and et cetera, to put pressure that, this is not right, this is not how we do business, because FIFA doesn't exist without a sport, without teams playing there. So I would think that would be a motivator for them if they were going to have, 20% or 30% of the teams not play in a World Cup. If that was something that unless they think it's great too. I don't know how they feel about it, so I don't know what that is. So I'd like to have your opinion on what do the teams feel about the scandal.
Yeah, I think the teams are all governed by the federations and the federations of the country. So the actual teams, it goes higher up into like the U.S. Soccer Federation. But you have to remember that the way that FIFA has viewed and is still viewed around the rest of the world is still positive from some of these countries. So the countries that aren't as positive, there has been reports, there's been stuff dating back to 91, you know, really for the past 15 years. People through media outlets have been trying to expose FIFA, but because FIFA has been looked upon as in a positive light, and because they've literally have just not even entertained these accusations, it's just kind of fallen by the wayside until 2015.
Would it be accurate to say they've done a lot for the game, apart from the tawdriness associated with this in the last 30, 40 years?
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of money that marketing companies, sports marketing companies are making off of these games or even these tournaments, you know, not many people know what the Gold Cup is, but the Gold Cup is a CONCACAF, which is North America and Central America. It's a tournament year. Those are billions of dollars of marketing rights that people were benefiting from. Mm-hmm. So whether they were federations that, even the U.S., you know, and I think as you continue with the FIFA scandal, it's going to be really interesting because right now we're only looking at the top. And it will be really interesting when we get to some of the other tournaments, if some of the larger organizations, Brazil's, you know, they just had the 2014 World Cup, what really comes out there. Because I think that this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
You know, I think you raised a really interesting question about the teams, the players, because you're right. I mean, it is run by the federations. But just recently, you know, you had Hope Solo, who is, you know, a very well-known female soccer player here, leading a bit of a movement saying, hey, we're not going to go to Brazil because of... Now, I think that's kind of gotten resolved a little bit, that the U.S. women are saying they're going to play. But there's some bottom-up pressure there. And I personally think that kind of stuff is good. I was pleased that she stood up and said what she was saying about the potential health hazards. Or playing in Qatar in the heat. They did actually move it to the fall from...
Right, that's what I was just going to say. Is I actually think, to answer your question, is that it got to that point. It got to that pinnacle of, wait, why are we going to Russia? Why are we going to Qatar? Because now we're changing what the rest of the world leagues are. You know, the World Cup's always in the summer. Well, now in Qatar, they were making simulated clouds cover because it was too hot. There's no
125 degrees in the summer.
There's no alcohol at games, which that's what a lot of the fans want to do. So I think, to answer your question, it hit that pinnacle of like, well, why are we changing the rest of the leagues around the world to accommodate for this World Cup in this country, that it doesn't make sense.
And there's also, they're of course for good in a number of different ways, both for the rights of LGBT people, but also sport in Russia, unfortunately, is highly racist. And so there's a movement from the bottom up, from the grassroots, if you will, to boycott the Russian game by African players. And Russia are actually taking, to their credit, some very proactive steps to stop out some of the racial language that's used. It's very vulgar stuff, so I won't describe it any further, but some of the things that are done against black players when they play in Russia. So, and actually there's an enormous, I would say, force for good from the bottom up, from player activism, if you will.
Yeah, and it comes from the superstars. It comes from the superstars of those teams that play in the most high-profile leagues, the English Premier League, the ones that were on the African team saying that we're not going to play in Russia. And so there were players that came out, and I think that, to answer your question once again, that these World Cups really, really put FIFA on display.
I mean, Russia wouldn't have it if anyone could do it in the next 2 years. Because of the Ukraine, Russia would probably lose the games. But nobody can organize their country within 2 years to put on the World Cup. Not even Germany or the United States probably could get it done in 2 years. So we'll stay in Germany. It might not be in Qatar in 2022. It's one more week.
Just
one more from the audience, please. We have Kathy Cunningham, and we have Preston Holcomb. May we
absolutely
have that, please?
Kathy Cunningham, I'm a board member. My comments are, first I'd like you to comment on this. My view of Mary Jo White at the SEC right now is, frankly, she's neutralized and running out of term. She can't get new commissioners appointed. And what's frustrating is these huge multi-$100 million settlements are being paid for by the shareholders. And, you explain it away as an extraordinary charge, you tell them what your EPS would have been without it, and life goes on. Why do they not take a stronger stance and litigate individuals? Your example, for example, with the Barclays bankers, just two of them. Why are they not more aggressive? Because I don't think the message gets through. Every day in Wall Street we see 200, 400, 900 million. So what? Life goes on.
Right.
Nobody personally is being held responsible.
Right. I would say, having worked in private practice under Mary Jo White and Andrew Seresny for about 4 years or so on a daily basis, I've never met two hardworking humans in my life. In all honesty, I've never met smarter, hardworking folks. Mary Jo is the type of woman who will send out emails at 3 a.m. because she's still up, and then she's up 2 hours later. And so, my personal sense is if she and Andrew Seresny had their druthers, they'd be going after folks aggressively on an individualized basis. Now, of course, the SEC doesn't have jurisdiction for criminal charges, right? So, we'd be looking, we have to look at the DOJ there in part. The SEC does go after some individuals, but they're smaller matters. They're not, high dollar, and their authorities are a little bit limited, right? They do have to take into consideration, is the juice worth the squeeze to bring a case where they may ultimately end up only getting $50,000 in a civil monetary penalty from somebody, but that takes time away from sort of larger, bigger players, and so I think that's some of it. I certainly agree with you that the way to make these things stick is to go after individuals and not just organizations, because indeed we do end up kind of penalizing the wrong folks here. The problem is, in part, individual cases are tremendously difficult to prove because you have to prove intent in most scenarios, and the higher level, folks on the board, senior management, the way corporations are structured, they are usually not involved in the day-to-day, right? And so they're consequently pretty insulated from sort of that knowledge requirement and being able to satisfy it. So, we saw those risks come out in the British case. It can be tremendously hard to prove a person's criminal intent, and so it's much easier to go after a risk-averse company, get a giant headline with a big number. But I agree, it doesn't have exactly the same deterrent effect. I will just, if I can add just one.
We're going to shortly run out of time. I do want to make sure we get Professor Holman.
Absolutely, John.
Just wondering about intelligence gathering and anticipation on all of these cases, both external and internal. Jamie mentioned that for years this has gone on without any real intense scrutiny until it just explodes. So I would ask are there efficient or good watchdogs from the media, sports reporters, or whatever, who drop the ball on this? As for the other controversies, the internal intelligence gathering, both VW and GM, to my knowledge, when board members were asked about the controversy, their first statement was, I just heard about it in the news this morning. Now, it's fine to rely on a good whistleblower program, which are all, valid, but in a sense, a whistleblower program is an admission of failure. We really haven't come up with other ways to get this information trickling up to the board. So, just wondering about your reactions to those two issues, both the external and the internal intelligence gathering.
If you look at the internal stuff, what I find very interesting is Sarbanes-Oxley was designed to address that. I mean, basically, the whole law was passed so somebody like Ken Lay could say, I didn't know what Jeff Skilling was doing. And what we ended up with Sarbanes-Oxley is a bunch of minutia in terms of how things get accounted for. So much so that my sister is a CFO of an aggregate company. They basically mine rock, crush it up, and sell it to people who are building roads. Because of Sarbanes-Oxley's requirements on inventory, they literally were hiring planes that could fly over and take three-dimensional photographs of piles of rock, so they could more easily estimate, or more accurately estimate, how many rocks they had, how much it was worth. Now, it seems to me that that wasn't the intent of the law, and that the intent of the law was to address the issues that you're raising, for both senior executives and board members. Oh, I just heard about this. So it seems like we've sort of failed with that. We've put in a gigantic regulatory piece into play with Sarbanes-Oxley. I mean, it's costing companies, millions of dollars every year to be in compliance, but yet, as you mentioned, we don't seem to have really been able to get at the intent. And I don't know how to deal with it. The external thing, there is the British journalist, I forget his name, the white-haired guy, who has been crying out forever, and now he's feeling that he's being vindicated. But I guess it was, one guy, right? But he's been after these folks for a long time.
The SEC of the Madoff stuff and not being enacted for years.
Yeah. I mean, what do you guys?
Well, yeah, I just think when you're talking about external pressure, something that talks about like fraud and bribery, it's really hard to exactly tie down because there was so much unaccounted cash flow. So there was no exact numbers, and they're still conflicting up to now. So reporters' validity to their stories, it was difficult. But to go back to really the main thing, and we talked about the values, having shared values. What's top-down leadership? Well, the way that FIFA was viewing their leadership, they were in the right. So when asked or when accused, they were very secret with the way that they responded, and they were very hush-hush. But external pressure just happens as we continue to get more connected around the world globally, is everybody gets their media from different outlets, whether that's Twitter, newspapers, online, stuff like that. So I felt that it all came to a pinnacle. But there were journalists for years that have been trying to get after FIFA.
Just as Paul was talking about the cozy relationships earlier, the revolving door, part of the problem of cozy relationships between reporters sometimes and what they're reporting on. So sports reporters sometimes become cheerleaders and want to suck up and get partial benefits out of the internet. Maybe the same. It doesn't seem that the same is true of business reporters, because some of them are pretty tenacious, but some maybe not.
There's a very good book called The Halo Effect, which actually would disagree somewhat with your point, is that companies which are extremely well thought of, in a general sense, are actually given a free pass on lots and lots of things. The particular example in The Halo Effect, a book by Professor Rosenschlag, as Enron was a classic example. Best place to work, number one employer in the company, accolades, going really almost up to the day of collapse. And his assertion is that journalists actually gave Enron a free pass for many, many years, and there was much, much going on that they could have reported on earlier. We have another question from Hugh, please. Question or comment, of course.
Yes, maybe a little bit of both. Hugh Rice. We've been talking a lot about the catching the bad guys. It seems to me that from a business perspective, the thing that we want to do is to avoid these kind of things happening in the first place. And if you think about the cultural things, the thing that I'm really interested in is that in every case that we do talk about, these three cases and BP and the whole country of Brazil, if you want to talk about that situation, it's that these problems that occur don't just, if we catch the bad guy, that doesn't really solve the problem. It's that the organization's been damaged. So if we're trying, if the objective is to provide a return to shareholders, the company has to survive, it has to do well, it has to have a good reputation. So it seems to me that the message inside of a company and the culture building inside of a company has to be to do the right thing because it's in the best interest of the company, the employees, the customers, and the shareholders. It's not just about, well, we'll do good for the shareholders, but we can not do the right thing for the customer. Ultimately, not doing the right thing for the customer and for society damages the company, therefore damages the shareholder. It seems to me that's the message we ought to be talking about, not about how do we regulate or prosecute after something's already happened. How do we prevent it from happening in the first place?
Well, I think that just in the FIFA case, that there was an institutional failure just in their organizational structure, because now they were just giving too much power to those executives. So I think to answer your question about culturally, you also have to look about the organizational structures of the company to make sure that what you're talking about is being met through the structures of the organization.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's kind of why I posed that question about responsibility to shareholders, responsibility to community, because I really do believe if you take the long view, you are doing the right thing. I think as the gentleman back there said about shared values is also the right thing. I do think that, and this comes back to say something like LIBOR, in our quarterly results-driven society, sometimes the long term gets lost, and so we do move into the short term. And I really do think that if you are looking at the long term, you look at it from the perspective that you just raised. We do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and as a result, we are going to be a more successful enterprise who's not only doing well for our shareholders, but doing well in general. So I really agree with what you said.
Others, please. Oh, yeah, yes, please. We get a microphone over here. Is that Jim? Do I need
You bet.
from the distance?
So Jim Blair, I'm a risk management consultant and work with publics, privates, small, large, nonprofits, profits, and so on. And I think a lot of the conversation today identifies a whole lot of characteristics about what causes sort of this lack of ethical behavior. And I couldn't help but sit here and think about, well, all right, so where's a lesson about controls? And many of the people in this room are board members, and so thank you for doing all that sort of stuff. But there's a message that I'm learning from particularly ethical clients, and I've actually found some. And it is the word healthy skepticism. So there's the natural tendency at quarterly meetings, presentations to the boards, and management, God forbid, would never want to report bad news, right? And we're all pretty happy when it's good news. And so there's a euphoria that maybe is the halo thing or whatever. But the message that I think all of us ought to take out of here is that no matter what information we're receiving, if there's a governance process, there's always the notion of healthy skepticism about where did the numbers come from, what are they based on, why is the good news so good, and how is it going to be continued. So at least my observation is that this is a personal practice that each of us need to put in place, and God forbid I need to do it too. But it's a recommendation that I think can be healthy for all of us. And so we got to figure out a way to turn the tide. It won't come from regulation.
I was a bank investigator of some of the banking disasters of the 1990s, and one of the things that's almost always true is that where the disaster occurred had been the most profitable department beforehand. Right. That's an interesting thing. Yeah. And that is, I think, a function of the halo effect. That it's hard with all the stresses and all the pressures and all the problems that you have to solve. When something's going well, it's very hard to take off the rose-tinted glasses and actually scrutinize it just as heavily as you would something where something's failing. So I think it's a great point. You have something for us, Dan?
I was just trying to fill in the gap. Go ahead.
Pat Montgomery, executive in residence at University of Denver Daniels School. I was in risk management in two large investment banks, 2005 to 2014, and really supporting some of your comments. Between quarterly meetings and the regulators, I would argue that any of the global investment banks, they care about two things, as we all know: making money, keeping the Fed away. That's it. And the concept of ethics, is very interesting because the collegiality that you mentioned gets in the way, quarterly results, and the Fed. and governance helps. You know, we did some really interesting things in the governance area. But I'm interested if anybody did put in place a chief ethics officer or some function, sorry, I have no voice today, that challenges this concept of, you know, both quarterly results, keep the Fed away, and do the right things. I don't know if anybody's done that.
Chief ethics officer would be the single disliked position in the business. And I know the banking industry's had to do it, and they pay those people an enormous amount of money to get put in a room and nobody talks to them. It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. It's like Sarbanes. It's an enormous Band-Aid over an amazing wound that didn't accomplish very much.
So the governance is a big piece.
A chief ethics officer, in my view, cannot be successful without a governance structure that actually is cross-organization that supports what they do. So the chief ethics officer isn't the referee. It's got to be an administrator of what a governance process does.
Yeah, you get into basically the line staff issue. Chief ethics officers, chief compliance officers. I remember many years ago I worked for an oil company, and they always took great pains to make sure that their chief affirmative action officer was a white guy, so less easily dismissed. But what you're saying, I think, is so right, is that chief ethics officer is still in a staff position, and it really goes to line operating people to make sure that you operate in an ethical manner. Chief ethics officer, I believe, can nudge those people, but he or she really, in the end, is unlikely to be able to control a lot of their behavior.
A lot of it is tone at the top. Tone at the top. If the highest levels of senior management are stressing the importance of ethics in a real and robust way, in a regular way, and people feel like they can push back even if there's a short-term revenue hit, I think you will see some shifts.
What do people think about that? Having an ethics committee? Yes, please. General?
I'm sorry, I wasn't going to answer.
You're stretching.
I was going to go back to what she was saying.
Oh, please do. Please do.
What I wanted to say was that I was a chief ethics officer for a large international trading company before I went out on my own. And what I found was that you cannot be the policeman, because if you are the policeman, then nobody wants to listen to you when you're trying to build that culture. So instead, I see the role as a facilitator or the enabler, and you want to get into the organization and make contacts that then can model that behavior for you. And then the best thing you can do is become an even playing field with some of those economic drivers, because reality is your business is not in business to drive ethics, it's in business to make money. So you want to make that ethics piece a part of what you are doing with those drivers. And the role that I find that you have the most influence is pointing out when the decisions don't get the right effect. And the last thing I would say is you got to figure out what's in it for them. If they understand what's in it for them to do it this way, then they will, even if it takes a little bit longer. If they don't, they never will, because it doesn't work.
I think what John over here was saying about the idea of that we need to operate. It's in our best interest to act ethically if we want to make money in the long term. That's kind of what I heard you saying. I think it's exactly what you're saying.
Exactly. And your job is to point that out. What is the best? How is it the best interest? Because sometimes it's not obvious.
Very good. What else do we have? Feel free to jump in, by the way. I'm touched off mid-strike for not quite sure where we were. Professor Holcomb, you made a very, very interesting point about the role of the whistleblower, whether we need actually a whistleblower policy. And I thought that was very interesting, having worked in banks, again, having worked in banks and having been an investigator in banks. It was interesting to me that these frauds, which seem minor on today's scale, a couple $100 million, a trivial amount rounded. But having said that, with the amount of internal and external regulation on a bank, they had middle office regulation, back office regulation, front office regulation, compliance officers, internal audit, external audit, the UK equivalent of the SEC, the UK equivalent of the Department of Justice. There's lots and lots of scrutiny, and yet a couple of people managed to, with the knowledge of lots of people around them, there was plenty of smoke, but a couple of people managed to invest a couple $100 million. So I found that, at the time, I found that interesting, because we often think about structural solutions. We'll put in a function, or we'll put in an officer, or we'll put in some sort of governance process, or we'll put in something hard. But in fact, it seems to me, this is a hypothesis, I throw this out to everybody as a question, is can you ever build a good enough mousetrap? And that, do we have to rely on culture? Does anyone have a thought about that they'd like to?
You can't spend enough money.
There's not enough money.
You can pay for detecting falls. Paying for preventing falls is really, really hard. And there's always somebody smarter than the mouse.
Other views from either up here on that versus structural versus cultural solutions? Is that something you spend time thinking about?
Well, just look at the law back there, and if you look at Daniel's, the very first pillar is ethical practice. And at least in my courses, everything that we talk about, I try to bring in something that talks about, well, what are the ethics of this situation? And it's interesting to see, even younger students, undergraduates sometimes, sort of not seeing things wrong oftentimes. And so I think that that's one way is, as educators, it's one of the things that we can focus on. It sounds like you do it with your soccer players, is to help bring forward sort of a newer generation who are actually considering ethics as important as their paycheck and their bonus and all of that. So I mean, I think that's one way. And I do think that is, just to give a little plug for Daniels, I do think that's something that we do pretty well around here.
As part of the legacy, of course, the college.
Yeah, I think it comes down to educating and starting at whatever age that is. You know, you don't talk about ethics practice until you get almost to some sort of undergrad and maybe even some sort of grad work. So there's no introduction to it. So for us, I think there's an individual accountability, and I think that no matter what structures you set up, no matter what mousetraps happen, you're right, there's always going to be somebody that's smarter. But and I can only speak about the men's soccer program here, is we, 5 years ago, everybody talks about, oh, why did we have a successful year this past season? Well, the real reason was because we changed the culture 4 years ago. When I became the assistant coach here, we started to look differently about who we were bringing in. And we started to look at only academics and saying, okay, if these guys are getting academic scholarships, they are already showing a high level of discipline and structure to what they want to do. Then when we recruit kids, instead of telling all the kids that, hey, you're the best player, you can do this, we can do this for you, we actually, the first correspondence that we have with them, we tell them the things that they think that we think that they need to work on. Then if they respond back, and that they want to be a part of the culture, we know that they're in line with everything else. When we bring them on campus for visits, we don't bring them on campus on the weekends for social. We bring them during the week where they have to go to class, they have to meet professors, just like they would in a normal student-athlete experience for us. It's a lot. The kids get up at 6:30 in the morning, they have practice, then they go to class, then they go to tutoring, and it's a full day. So when kids are signing up to be a part of the men's soccer program, we are pretty transparent with what is that going to be like. And for us, we are very, very strict where we have team punishments. And I know teams are probably a little bit different than organizations, but if somebody misses class, that person actually blows the whistle and everybody else has to run. It always happens about once a year to one of the freshmen, and then it doesn't happen again. But a lot of people want to know, hey, well, how did you get the program into being a top 10? And it did not happen just when I took over. This will be my 5th year. So this was the first year that everyone fell within that recruiting model.
Very good. Very interesting. More from the audience. Oh, yes, please. Who have we not? Anyone? No? Yes, back to you.
One other point on that is, with whistleblowing inside the banks, for example, we have, from the time you join the bank, it's all online, right?
Yes.
And you get all these cases, and you see all these situations and you're sort of brainwashed into the concept of whistleblowing. Who to report to, the compliance officer, your manager. But in reality, you don't see clear, visible leadership talking about it. It's not visible. Your comment about governance and the culture of the firm, if there were town meetings and the CEO and the head of the trading desks actually talked about this as a bad thing, it's a lot different in online training.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. So the online training looks like a good start, but actually having visible leadership around it from the CEO. Because actually, I can imagine if I was CEO, we'd have this online ethics training for whistleblowers. I hope I never hear from them. In a way, right?
And most of the time, that wish is true. You don't hear from them. That's why the Dodd-Frank actually put the bribery. Well, I shouldn't use that word. The pay per whistle situation into place was because Sarbanes didn't work for free. So Dodd-Frank now shares a percentage of the findings or of the fines with the ultimate whistleblower, and the largest one that's been paid is $30 million. I mean, it's not a bad deal for just a whistle in 1 day's worth of work. But and quite frankly, I think the statistic is 1 report per 1,000 employees per year, roughly. So it is not much of a impact deal.
That's interesting. Would you, in your opinion, is that a template that other industries might emulate in some regard or another? That particular aspect of it.
You mean the payment?
Yeah, sure. To encourage sort of incentive to encourage.
Well, of course, it came out of Dodd-Frank regulations, so it's not any company's great idea. Ideally, as you work with business, you'd really like to solve questions and issues right within the management structure. So there's the tone at the top, but there's also now the tone at the middle. And that's how the top impacts the people who really run the business. And so it's got to be a culture. When there's a problem, wasn't it Honda that initially, or Toyota initially said that any manufacturing employee, when they saw a flaw, had the right and the responsibility to shut down the line?
Structural drivers to to culture, to shifting it, right? And some of it is, making sure when you're hiring, you're actually looking at more than just, what, revenue figures somebody generated, right? When you're deciding, bonuses, don't just peg it to purely deal size, right? And when you're deciding who's going to get promoted, I mean, all of these, there are certain structural things that can be put into place. Because you need to make sure that the message that you're sending is not offset by the reality of how you're funding people, right? That'll come off as profoundly contradictory, and at the end of the day, your workforce is going to look at who's actually getting rewarded for what behavior, and so you want to make sure that message is consistent. I think.
Well, but the whole point about senior executives, your point. Doing things that encourage this, I think, makes sense. It's, I think, I was working with a guy who was the president of a global manufacturing organization for a very large pharmaceutical company. He had like 50,000 people reporting to him around the world. And he was complaining to me one day about silos. And I said, well, what you need to start asking people is, when they bring something to you, who else needs to know about this? He actually put a sign behind his desk, and that said, "Who else needs to know?" And within about 5 months, people would come in with a proposal to him and say, "And I need to talk to so and so and so and so about this." And I think you can do the same thing with ethics. If you were in a senior leadership position, is if something comes up, you could say, "Okay, what are the ethical implications of this decision we're about to make?" And if a senior executive is asking that question, people start, and doing it repeatedly, not just occasionally, people start to come to that executive and say, well, we've looked at this from a P&L perspective, we looked at it from this perspective, and ethically, we think we're all right. We think we're doing the right thing here. So I really do believe that, your point about senior executives taking the lead and just even asking those kind of questions gets people thinking about how to behave, and I think that will go a long way instead of trying to catch people who are doing something wrong.
Well, I think the proactive approach is exactly right.